Undercover boss orders eggs, freezes when waitress says she only eats what customers leave behind. The sky was leaden gray, no rain, but damp and cold enough to make people pull their collars tight. A morning that felt like even the weather was holding something back, not quite ready to reveal it. Michael Carter stepped down from a modest rental car, adjusting his baseball cap and plain jacketon outfit no one would guess belonged to a CEO. He pushed open the door of Sunrise Diner, branch number 42, a quiet little diner nestled between suburban storefronts. Inside, the lights were bright, the tables nearly full, yet the atmosphere was strangely hushed. There was no staff banter, no light laughter from a spilled glass. Every movement was measured, mechanical like part of some invisible assembly line. Michael sat by the window, removed his gloves, and ordered a black coffee. He looked around. On paper, this branch had good revenue, no red flags. But in the past 2 months, he had received 3 anonymous reports from former employees. Sudden resignations, reward system exclusions, signs of tip skimming. Now, witnessing it himself, he understood. Revenue doesn't determine a system's health. The spirit of the people who run it does. In the corner of the dining room, a young woman in a light brown apron moved nonstop. Slender, hair tied neatly back, worn shoes but always standing tall. She thanked guests when taking receipts, bowed gently while serving, and smiled even though breakfast hours had long passed. Her name was Maggie. Michael learned that as she passed his table and said softly, "Good morning, I'll be right back with your coffee." She was the one truly running the whole front of house, not through authority, but with a presence so kind it demanded attention. And yet, in her eyes, Michael saw something quiet like she had grown used to no one asking if she was okay. In that brief moment, he knew something was wrong. Not in the reports, not in the KPI dashboards, but in the eyes of a waitress who had never stopped moving, even when no one truly saw her. Michael sat silently behind his freshly refilled black coffee, watching the space with the stillness of someone used to hearing what no one dared say aloud. When Maggie returned, bringing a plate of hot sunny-side-up eggs and a slice of crisp toast, she still smiled gently, but not emptily. "Is there anything else you need, sir?" Her voice was calm, polite, but with something exhausted underneath. Michael shook his head, then, almost as a casual remark, asked, "Have you had breakfast yet?" A simple question, just a breath of everyday routine. Maggie hesitated slightly, then gave a faint smile, her eyes lowering, as if she were sharing something that wasn't a big deal. "I just eat what customers leave behind. Some days, when there's nothing left, I drink water to get through." The answer was light. No bitterness, no complaints. Yet to Michael, it rang in his mind like a bell crashing down onto the very faith he had once carried when founding Sunrise Diner. A restaurant chain where the very first line he wrote on the whiteboard was, "No one goes unseen, no effort goes uncounted." And now, a staff member, standing in the middle of the dining floor, working tirelessly, was surviving on leftovers. Michael put down his knife and fork, stunned, not from pity but from outrage, not at the girl in front of him, but at his own system. A system that was running smoothly on the silence of those who most needed to be heard. He looked up at Maggie. She had already turned away, blending back into the steady rhythm, continuing her work as if she had never uttered anything out of place. But for Michael, that moment had opened a door, not a door to suspicion, but a door to determination, to uncover what had driven a dedicated waitress to live off the compassion of strangers. Michael's coffee had long gone cold, but he hadn't touched his utensils. All of his attention was now fixed on each movement in the restaurant, not as a diner waiting for service, but as someone who had just discovered a crack in what he thought was a rock-solid wall. Maggie spun like clockwork through the peak morning shift. She took orders, remembered special preferences, carried trays, poured water, replaced silverware, wiped tables, all in one fluid motion. No customer had to ask twice. An elderly patron dropped a napkin, and Maggie picked it up in a blink like she had a mental map of every inch of the diner. But then, Michael noticed a strange pattern repeating. Every time a customer handed over a card to pay, Maggie, the one who had served them from start to finish, would slow down, ever so slightly, as if it were a reflex honed by repetition. And immediately after, one of the 2 male staff, Ryan or Jason, would step in, take the POS machine, process the transaction with a polite smile, and walk back to the counter, unnoticed. Michael narrowed his eyes. Ryan and Jason only handled a few VIP tables near the register regulars, large orders. The rest of the packed dining area was entirely on Maggie's shoulders. However, in the POS system, The person holding the device is the only one credited with digital tips from card transactions. Michael pulled out his phone and logged into the Sunrise system using his highest-level administrative access. A two-factor authentication prompt appeared. Within seconds, he had all the information for branch number 34 in front of him. Post-system role assignments. Ryan L. R. Langford, full POS access. Jason M., secondary POS, afternoon only. Maggie R., no POS privileges assigned. Michael frowned and switched to the system update logs. Patch ID 6.1.4. Date applied 6 weeks ago. Description: optimizing morning pause workflow, reducing transaction time. Effect: all digital tips under $15 automatically redirected to ID R. Langford. Approved by Doug Hayes, store manager. He froze. Doug Hayes, the same man who had once declared in the company's quarterly bulletin that every drop of sweat deserves to be counted. And R. Langford, none other than Doug's biological nephew. Michael wasn't surprised anymore, but a chill ran down his spine. A manual patch disguised under a polished label process optimization, but in reality, it was a calculated manipulation mechanism. The true servers like Maggie were denied access to process transactions, had no ID in the system, and received no digital tips whatsoever, even though they were the ones sweating through every morning. She was completely invisible. Michael looked up. Maggie was gently pressing her lips together as she brought out a tray of egg tarts to a corner table, bowing slightly as she apologized for the delay, even though the delay wasn't her fault. And he knew the fault wasn't in the service speed or the handover process. The fault lay in the system he once trusted wholeheartedly, a system that rewarded those who were good at handling the POS while ignoring those who knew how to handle human kindness. Michael didn't take his eyes off Maggie, but this time he didn't just observe, he began recording. From beneath the edge of his coat, Michael lightly tapped a small mic to activate it. No need for dialogue, just capture what was seen and unfolding, in a way the internal system reports never would. When a young couple at table 8 stood up and pulled out their wallet, Maggie had just bent slightly to excuse herself when Jason stepped in as if he had arrived according to a pre-written script. He didn't ask, didn't smile at Maggie, just raised the pause device and processed the payment. Michael recorded every step. The young man tapped in a $5 tip, and then the POS screen displayed the name Langford. Maggie took a step back, softly. No one noticed. Michael did, but he didn't stop there. On his admin app, he accessed the full POS transaction history from the past 7 days. A data table appeared, transactions under $15 to 328 entries. POS handler name, 100% listed as R. Langford. Maggie's ID, not listed in POS handler records. System note, posrole pending assignment, but days. 41 days. 41 days Maggie had been working full-time, yet was still marked as pending in the system. Not a single tip passed through her name. She worked. They collected. The system stayed silent. Michael closed his laptop. His hand instinctively clenched the coffee spooner reaction he didn't even notice. In his mind, an old question began to echo he had asked himself when opening his very first diner. Do I still remember why I started? And at that very moment, a scene struck him. Maggie hurried back to the counter, her right hand gripping the stainless steel ledge, her left arm wrapped around her stomach. No one noticed. But to someone who had worked every role in the kitchen, Michael knew exactly what that sign meant. Hunger, not just from skipping breakfast, but from too many mornings like this one. She sat down beside the storage locker, gently opened a small bottle of water, took a few sips, then breathed deeply as if those 30 seconds alone were all she needed to get back to the tray of pastries still waiting for her. And she did come back. Her steps were no longer steady, but she kept going, still nodded, still smiled. And in that very moment, a small gesture, but one that pierced straight to the core, Michael made a decision. He would come back, not to inspect, but to stand with the good people erased by the system. And he knew by doing that, he wasn't just correcting a line of code, he was restoring trust. The belief that in a place called Sunrise, the sun still had a chance to rise on time, even if someone had tried to block its light under the name of optimization. Friday morning, 6:58 a.m. The diner had only been open for 10 minutes. Morning light still shimmered outside the fogged-up window panes. Inside, no one knew yet that this morning would be unlike any other before it. The door swung open. Michael Carter stepped in, not wearing a hooded coat, no fake glasses, no polite smile of a regular customer, But as himself, CEO and founder of Sunrise Diner, behind him came Julia from Human Resources, two internal audit specialists, and the head of the POS tech team. Doug Hayes, the branch manager, stepped out from his office, still holding a half-finished cup of coffee. His face stiffened slightly, like he'd just run into someone familiar he hoped never to see again. "Mr. Carter, what a surprise." "Not a surprise, Doug," Michael interrupted. "We're just right on time." He gave a nod. Julia placed a Bluetooth speaker on the cashier counter. One tap. The recording played. "Tips under $15? Route them all to Ryan's ID, saves trouble. That girl Maggie doesn't even have an ID. She's just there for show. Let the system run like that." Doug approved it. "Who has time to dig?" The sound sliced through the air like a blade, tearing off the veil. Doug stood frozen. Ryan, behind the counter, stiffened his hand, halted mid-swipe on the POS device. Michael didn't raise his voice, but each word landed like nails, hammered into the very circuitry of the system. "I've reviewed the reports." And he opened his tablet and projected the data onto the large screen mounted near the register. Total number of digital tips under $15 over the last 6 weeks. 481 transactions. Percentage routed to IDR Langford. 100%. Name Maggie R. appears in none of the tip logs. Doug opened his mouth to object. "I just wanted the payment process to run smoother in the mornings." Michael paused, looked at him. "You optimized the system so your nephew could collect all the tips every shift," he said slowly, clearly, without retracting a single word. "While Maggie lives off leftover food from customers." He paused for a beat, his eyes drifting toward the kitchen corner, where Maggie was quietly scrubbing a tray. "That's not optimization. That's theft." The room fell completely still. Julia spoke next. "Doug Hayes and Ryan Langford are terminated effective immediately. All POS system access and internal management credentials will be revoked at once. The legal department has already been notified." Doug said nothing more. Ryan lowered his head, placed the POS terminal on the counter, and quietly walked away, like a shadow peeled off the wall of silence. Michael no longer looked at them. He looked at Maggie. "Would you step forward, please?" Maggie flinched slightly. She wasn't used to being called by name, even less so to being the center of anything. The entire diner was dead silent. She stepped out, one step at a time. Her hands still carried the scent of baking powder, and her hair was still loose, not yet tied back. But her back was straight, her eyes lifted. Michael nodded. "We're sorry for not seeing you sooner," he said. And in that moment, Maggie didn't need to be celebrated. She just needed to be called by her real name, to step out from the shadows. Because today, she was no longer someone excluded from the system. She was the answer for everyone who had spoken up and been ignored. Maggie stepped forward, her hands still dusted with flour, the apron she wore wrinkled near the hem, but no one noticed those details. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath as she stopped in the center of the room. No one spoke, but the eyes of her colleagues, those who had worked shifts alongside her, without knowing the truth now, quietly turned toward her. A bit of confusion, some guilt, but more than anything, something appearing for the first time: respect. Michael wasn't looking at spreadsheets anymore. He was looking at a person. "Do you remember what you said that day?" he asked, voice soft. "You said there were days you survived on just water, because no one left anything?" Maggie nodded gently. "That was when I knew. The issue here wasn't about leftover food. It was about the worth of a human being erased from the system." Ins 4. Michael took a step forward. He didn't bow, but his words settled gently on Maggie's shoulders, not to burden, but to lift. "You endured without complaining. You did all the work without receiving your share, but you stayed. You didn't give up." From the corner of the diner, a middle-aged customer set down his fork and clapped softly, but sincerely. Then another. A female staff member set down a glass of water, stood tall, and nodded toward Maggie. A third round of applause followed, then a fourth, a fifth. No one orchestrated it, but everyone understood. They weren't clapping for show. They were clapping to say sorry, and to say that from now on, no one would be left behind. Julia stepped forward and handed Maggie a new system access card, her name, now printed clearly on the POS system badge. Below the line, access level, managerial candidate, pending review. "Starting today," Julia said, "you'll be the first to enter the Internal Management Challenge program. Not because of your circumstances, but because of the capability you've shown even in silence." Maggie opened the access badge, her hands slightly trembling. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. Michael smiled. He turned and walked toward the windowside table, the same one he had once sat at, posing as a quiet customer, sipping coffee while watching a frail girl struggle to stand steady on an empty stomach. Now, looking back, the table was still there. But the person standing in the diner was no longer the same because the system had failed. But some people had stood up and rebuilt it with their own hands and courage. Maggie was no longer the name erased from the list. She had become a living reminder of an old truth everyone knows but few dare to act on. When even the smallest voice is heard, only then can the system truly begin to breathe. 1 month later, early morning, the light of early summer streamed gently through the window panes of Sunrise Diner, Branch 34, casting a quiet, pure glow across the restaurant. No more tense silence, no more sidelong glances. Everything felt like it had a new heart beating, slower, more evenly, more honestly. Michael Carter stepped into the diner. No introduction, no announcement. He had simply returned not to inspect, but to witness. Right at the counter, a digital screen had been mounted above the shift schedule board. Tip sharing policy, transparent, public, protected. At the bottom, engraved on raw oak, fairness is not a gift, it's a structure. A young server stepped aside when she saw him, then smiled and quietly whispered, "Miss Maggie said you'd definitely drop by today." Michael simply smiled. From the back kitchen, Maggie stepped out, no longer wearing the faded apron, no longer the pale face of mornings without breakfast, no longer the cautious steps between crowded tables. Now she was the one in charge of the entire morning shift and more. On her left chest, the nameplate shimmered under the sunlight. Maggie Air, branch manager. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she smiled. That smile held none of the past. Michael nodded. He returned to the window-side table, the same spot where he once heard a quiet voice that awakened something deep within him. "I just eat whatever customers leave behind." Now, before him was a freshly brewed cup of coffee, hot, fragrant, and placed there by the very hands once erased from every assignment board in the system. Maggie sat across from him, no bowing, no asking permission, just presenceful and rightful. Michael lifted the cup of coffee, his hands slightly trembling not from fatigue, but from knowing that this moment was what the entire system had once forgotten to cherish. He spoke softly, as if speaking to all those who had never been heard. The most important things in a restaurant aren't on the menu. They are trust, dignity, and the courage to speak up, even when no one believes that voice matters. No. Outside the window, a little boy passed by, glanced back at the digital sign above the counter. He pointed and said to his mother in a clear voice, "This place is good, Mom. They share the work fairly here." Michael smiled gently. Then he looked down at the steaming cup of coffee on the table, not for its caffeine, but because today it carried something else. A quiet symbol of justice restored. Not loud, not flashy, just poured for the right person, at the right moment, and lifted by a hand that had once been overlooked. Maggie didn't say anything more. She just looked around the space that used to drain her every morning, then gently exhaled as if now, at last, she could truly breathe. A young staff member, Clara, stepped up to request time off because her younger brother had a fever. In the past, this kind of request had to go through. Doug's approval usually denied with a cold shrug. But today, Maggie only needed to ask one question. "Is anyone willing to switch shifts with her?" Immediately, someone from the kitchen raised their hand. Clara hurriedly thanked them, eyes glistening, and Maggie simply nodded. Family is the most valid reason to take a day off. Michael witnessed this scene without saying a word, but he knew culture in a diner isn't written in manual, sits lived through how people treat each other. An elderly guest once, a regular at this branch, came over and gently placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. "I didn't know who you were until last week, but thanks to you, this place has completely changed. I came back because now I can feel respect flowing from the kitchen all the way to the dining room." Michael simply smiled, shaking the man's hand with both of his. At the front counter, a new bulletin had just been pinned up. Sunrise Diner, branch number 34, pioneering unit in building a culture of sharing and transparency. Below was a team photo taken the previous week. Maggie stood at the center, not because she had accidentally stood in the middle, but because everyone had chosen her as the focal point. The girl who once bowed and asked guests for leftover food was now the one approving training budgets for new hires. The woman once unnamed behind the counter now had a voice that made the whole kitchen fall silent to listen. Michael looked at her and softly said, like a reminder he no longer needed to keep to himself, "Justice doesn't arrive on its own. It starts with one person brave enough to speak up, and it grows inside others who are brave enough not to look away." Lily, the new server, brought out another cup of coffee. She bowed, but when she looked up, There was no fear in her eyes. I made it using Maggie's recipe, she smiled. But I added a touch of cinnamon. I think that flavor deserves to be rediscovered. Michael took a sip. The cinnamon danced lightly on his tongue and he nodded. Perhaps it's not just justice, but hope too that needs to be poured again. To the right person, at the right moment, and this time not left to settle at the bottom of the cup.